the 4 decades of rock on 106.1 Rock Radio. All this week, the 60s. If you can remember it, you probably weren't there. Today, the music.
All week, it's the 4 decades of rock, and all this week, it's the 1960s. Let's talk music, and if we're going to talk music, we might as well talk to Mick Wall of this parish and of Classic Rock magazine.
Hello, Steve.
Hello, Mick, how are you?
I'm feeling very 60s.
I'm very glad. We wondered what was the oldest record that we play on Rock Radio, on the playlist of Rock Radio, because there's no way of telling us. The system couldn't tell us which is the oldest record, and we narrowed it down to 3 records. But the thing was, there were no definitive dates, but the Kinks, the Animals and the Stones were harder to pin down. We think the oldest record we play on Rock Radio that's on the playlist is Route 66 by the Stones. But what I want to talk about is the roots of rock. Does rock come from rock and roll? Is it that straightforward, Mick, or is it more complicated than that?
The answer to that is kind of both, really. I mean, clearly it does come from rock and roll because you're talking loud guitars, you're talking the big beat. Everything the Stones did early on arguably came from Bo Diddley. A lot of the early Beatles stuff came from Buddy Holly. And of course, right up to when you're talking about Led Zeppelin, you're talking about Elvis Presley being one of the hugest influences on Robert Plant.
Walking through a party in the county jail. The prison band was there, they began to wail. The band was jumping and the joint began to swing. You should have heard this knocked out jailbird sing that rock.
It seemed just plain wrong to be talking about the 60s and not to talk to our friend and colleague, Michael Thomas Sweeney.
Eddie Cochran, Buddy Holly and Gene Vincent always had a bigger following in the UK than they actually did, if you look at it, in the States. It died away then, rock and roll. There was very few bands in Britain carrying it on, with the exception of maybe Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, Joe Brown and the Brothers, and to a certain extent, the likes of Shane Fenton and the Fentones. But the Beatles and the Merseybeat bands, because it was Merseybeat that opened the door, because of the nature of the city, they'd carried on playing. So when the bands, say, in Manchester and Birmingham, etc., were trying to be the Shadows, all the Liverpool bands were still playing Long Tall Sally and Some Other Guy. It was Merseybeat that led the rock and roll renaissance, led of course by the Beatles.
I think the 2 main factors that really define that decade as distinct from what came before was, number 1, the advent of artist as singer-songwriter. After the Beatles, it was no longer acceptable to get Carole King and Neil Sedaka to write your hits for you. That was a key change, and the other really, really monumental shift in terms of music history comes in 1968, which was the first year that album sales actually overtook singles. The idea that you would create specifically an album's worth of material that had to be listened within the context of it being a contained body of work as opposed to just essentially a greatest hits. Up until the 60s, we had something called pop, we had something called rock and roll, but by the mid-60s, we've got something called rock.
What about the influence, Mick, of British rock and roll? I've read Jimmy Page, Pete Townsend and Tony Iommi, I think in Classic Rock magazine, all 3, talking about the influence of people like, and it struck me as quite odd that they would say this, Hank Marvin and Mick Green from Johnny Kidd and the Pirates on what they did.
Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath was the hugest Hank Marvin fan. I was absolutely enthralled to hear Tony talking about how he absolutely hero worshipped Hank Marvin. In fact, Hank Marvin was the reason Tony began playing electric guitar in the first place. And in fact, Cliff and the Shadows were enormously influential. I mean, Cliff, with his first few hits, was dubbed the English Elvis, and he very much styled himself in that manner. By the time you get Mick Green of the Pirates, people like Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck going to see Mick Green play, you are into another realm. You're into the realm of the beginning of the guitarist as gunslinger. And Mick very much represented that in the minds of very young English guitarists in the 60s.
We were huge fans of his. We saw him in 1959 in a rehearsal hall with Mickey Green on guitar and And God, he blew us away. You know, we actually decided to go three-piece after seeing Johnny Kidd. His band was a three-piece, you know, it was just guitar